Welcome everybody. How you doing today? Good. That's the energy we want to see in this group. Today we are excited to be here. All right, we're representing the Stephens MFA, the low residency program in screenwriting, which we operate out of Los Angeles. And we're very excited to have 5 of our absolutely most fabulous students coming to teach you about 5 women of early Hollywood who ran the town. That proves to us women have always run this town and need to run it again. That's the purpose. Thank you very much. All right? I just want to take a moment and have everybody recognize our Colombian native founder, Ken Lezebnik. He's right over here. He founded the program, and so we're now going to see the best people. I'm going to show you 5 people. I'm going to introduce them, look in the program for their names. I'm not going to give you a bio. And at the end, we're going to do questions. So if one of these women you hear about, you want to ask more, please wait. At the end of all 5 folks, we'll have about 15 minutes, and you can talk to whoever you like, right? So we're all good with that? We're going to start with Anita Lewis, who will be introduced to you by Toni and Anita Hull. All right.
Thank you. Okay. So it is my honor to share with you today a woman who I've come to know and absolutely fall in love with. She was a humorist, playwright, and screenwriter, Miss Anita Lewis. Early in her career, she helped shape the integral role that intertitles would play in the silent era. And she also became known as a master of satirizing sex and love and writing the type of character for women that we had seen men play for years. So Anita was born in Northern California in 1888, but her family eventually relocated to San Diego, California, where her father, R. Beers Lewis, ran a theater stock company. And between the acts, he showed short films. And this is where 22-year-old Anita got her taste for writing. So she sat down and decided to pen her first scenario, and she took the address off the Biograph film canister and sent it away. It was accepted, beginner's luck maybe, but it was produced by D.W. Griffith in 1912, and it's called The New York Cat, starring Lionel Barrymore, Lillian Gish, and the iconic Mary Pickford. Anita would pen hundreds of scenarios for Griffith. And eventually he hired her for $50 a week to write the scenarios for his biggest stars, making Anita probably one of the very first staff writers in Hollywood. Now, up until this point, intertitles were really just used to show time, place, passing of time, etc. But Anita decided to change that. She decided to make them interesting, wry, and funny, and I've chosen a few of my favorite intertitles here. Wherein it is shown that beefsteak produces a different style of lovemaking from prunes. The next day, Babs faced a domestic problem that would have made Ibsen green with envy. So she was very smart and well-read. Women who cease to exist to attract men often turn to reform as a second choice. I know that one very well. So it's no wonder that in 1917, Photoplay dubbed her the soubrette of satire, stating, "The most important service that Anita Lewis has so far rendered the screen is the elevation of the subcaption, first to sanity, then to dignity and brilliance combined." So along with director John Emerson, she saw a lot of success in Hollywood, but the duo decided to relocate to New York, where they also saw success on the screen and the stage, and they married. Despite the fact that Emerson was a cheater, a massive hypochondriac, which is an understatement, and, in my humble opinion, undeserving of Anita. But she loved him and stuck by his side regardless. But she did have eyes for another man by the name of H.L. Mencken. He provided her with witty banter and challenged her in a way that Emerson couldn't. But Mencken didn't love Anita quite the way she loved him. That being said, he would inspire her most pivotal work. Now, as the story goes, Emerson and Anita board a train from New York to Los Angeles, and on that train is Mencken and a blonde bombshell. And in Anita's words, "In the club car, if she happened to drop the magazine she was reading, several men jumped to retrieve it, whereas I was allowed to lug heavy suitcases from their racks while men, particularly my husband, failed to notice." Now, it wasn't the fact that this witless blonde had her husband's attention that bothered Anita. It was the fact that this witless blonde had Mencken's attention that really bothered her. So Anita thought, you know what? I'm going to get his attention with my writing. So she sat down with her pen and paper and wrote what we now know as Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. It started out as a serial in Harper's Bazaar, and then it became a book in 1925. It was also a film in 1929, which sadly has been lost. But most of us probably know it as an iconic film in 1953 with Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell. Now, if you haven't read the book, please go buy a copy and read it, because it is hilarious. I was laughing out loud even in 2016. It is so timeless, this book. And at first read, its lead character, Lorelei Lee, just seems like a dumb blonde. But I can tell you that Lorelei Lee is smart, she is clever, and she knows exactly how to manipulate men to get what she wants. Now, and it's an archetype that we still see today, and Anita created that archetype. Now, I think her better half happens to be Dorothy the brunette, who is also bold, brassy, and has a ton of zingers. And I really think that Dorothy is truly Anita Loos. And Dorothy had a lot of fans too. In particular, William Faulkner said to Anita, "Please accept my envious congratulations on Dorothy, but I wish I had thought of her first." A pretty decent compliment from William Faulkner. So blondes made Anita enough money for her to retire on, but Emerson would squander it away. I know. And in 1931, she had to go back to work, and her first project was adapting a play by the name of Red-Headed Woman for the screen. Now, the play is a melodrama, but Anita manages to turn it into a sexy satire, starring the incomparable Jean Harlow as the story's main character, Lil. Now, Lil is a terrible human being. She is a seductress, she's an adulterer, and she's an attempted murderer. But let me tell you something. You love Lil. You root for Lil. And up until this point, we had seen men play these roles and doing whatever they want and never suffering any consequences. And you know what? Lil never gets her comeuppance, and that's a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, in 1937, Anita had to have Emerson committed to a sanatorium because he was severely bipolar. But I gotta tell you, I think it gave her some freedom. And her first project, back to work after that happened, was adapting another play, The Women by Claire Booth Luce, which I have to say is a mediocre play, which hurts me because it's full of women's roles. It really is just kind of about bitchy women in society and leaves something more to be desired. And what Anita turns it into is this masterpiece of a comedy that really is a satire on high society and has these really elevated, smart, interesting female relationships, both negative and positive. And at the center of this story is Mary, who starts out as a powerless housewife, but then by the end, she is a kick-ass woman, you guys. She's awesome, which I think is just so telling, too, of what's going on in Anita's life at that time. And there are a lot of great one-liners in this one, which I'm a sucker for. And my favorite is said by Joan Crawford, who once walked this campus as a student. Yes. And it's brilliant. And by the way, there's a name for you ladies, but it isn't used in high society outside of a kennel. Pretty amazing. Anita passed away at the age of 93. She was 4'11", but feisty as hell. She penned screenplays, plays, essays, and 4 autobiographies. Her first one was called A Girl Like Her, so please read that book so we can keep her story alive. But like all comedians, Anita had a vulnerability to her that she rarely showed to people. But I found a quote that I'm in love with that I wanted to leave with you today that shows the softer side of Anita. "For so the human heart behaves through all its ups, downs, tears, laughter, and harrowing surprises. Well, my friend, that is life and art as they have got to be, either in or out of the show shops. So thank you, Anita, for paving the way for comedians like myself, and thank you all.
All right, we are now going to make this computer like me. Go away. So my computer should love me. There we go. We are now preparing. There we go. Now preparing for the next slide. All right, we are now preparing to hear about Jeannie McPherson from Amelia Phillips.
Hi, so show of hands, how many people have heard of Cecil B. DeMille? Great! How many people have heard of Jeannie McPherson? I think there's like 4 out of however many people are here. So if you have heard of Jeannie McPherson, you would know of her as Cecil B. DeMille's main scenarist. So back in the day, that's just another word for a screenwriter. This is what she looked like. She is very attractive. I'm just going to start here with some basic facts that you could get from, you know, I won't say a quick Google search, but just some facts of her life. She was born May 18th, 1887 in Boston into a prestigious family. Now this date is probably off by about 4 years, but as we'll see, a lot of her story is untold. She died August 26, 1946 in LA of cervical cancer. Again, that's something that is not really easy to find. She's an actress, writer, director, producer, pilot, suffragette. She was active fighting for the right to vote, and she even held office at Universal City, the original, newly formed. In 1927, she was one of 3 women out of 36 total people to form the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The other 2 were Bess Meredith and Mary Pickford. And in 1928, she was the highest paid scenarist at Famous Players Lasky, making $1,000 a week, which is something I would love to have right now. And of course, Cecil B. DeMille's scenarist. And so she is attractive, and but to overcome her looks, she had to work extremely hard. And I think this is indicative of her character. She wrote, "Don't expect favors, be prepared to work 24 hours a day, don't make the mistake of thinking that woman's traditional fragility and delicacy should relieve you of any responsibilities. If someone tells you you write like a plumber, accept it as truth and profit by it." Those are words to live by. Don't attract attention to yourself by your dress, and above all, don't be satisfied with just ordinary work. If you're not the best in your line, you might as well quit before you start. I think that this resonates. I mean, this is written like 80 years ago, right? This resonates even today. We have to reach above and beyond in order to play with the big boys, right? To play with the men. Needless to say, around 1915, 1920, she had a nervous breakdown. She worked extremely hard, and that was common for women at the turn of the century who were in film. So her early film career, this is her acting. In 1913, in 1908, she decided she wanted to be an actress. She was from a prestigious family. She was like, I could do this. She walked into D.W. Griffith's office, and she asked for a part day in and day out, supposedly, and she worked with them for 3 years. Then in 1911, she switched with Edison Films, and at the time, you mostly worked with a studio. You didn't just audition for random parts. There she worked with Oscar Apfel, and he went out west, and she followed, and that's when she met Cecil B. DeMille. In 1912, Universal is in Los Angeles, so she's in Los Angeles, she's working with Universal, and she's still acting. There was this film, Tarantula, that was over budget, underproduced, and she said, I can do this, I can do better. She took it over, nobody wanted to touch it. She wrote it, produced it, acted in it, directed it. It was one of the first 2-reelers, and it was a financial success for Universal, and it buoyed the studio. The studio was about to go under, and she saved it. So because of that, they gave her her own unit. She produced, that we know of, 6 films. Were helmed with her. They're lost to the time, but we know that she produced them. And she became an elected official at Universal City. During this time period, from 1908 to 1915, she acted in at least 147 films. That's that we know of, that she's credited with. A lot of times with these early films, they're just not credited. By 1913, she is working with Universal. She walks onto a set, she's scouting, and she meets Cecil B. DeMille, and the folklore goes, she wanted the space. and he was there. And he didn't know who she was, supposedly, which I find hard to believe. But supposedly he didn't know who she was, and he said, "Who are you? Get off my land, I'm filming here." She goes, "Where I come from, a man asks a woman to sit before he speaks to her." And supposedly he loved that snark, and they started working together. So here's a picture of Cecil in the middle, Jeannie is on his left, and then there's Constance, his wife, and Sissy. So, Jeannie was always around. Make of that what you will. Cecil B. DeMille was notoriously difficult to work with. She said, "No, he's not difficult to work with. He'll take advice from anyone if it's right." In 1915, however, he said, "You're done acting, you're going to work with me, and you're going to write." And that was the only way that he would allow her to continue to work in his films, more or less, it sounds like. So she said, "Okay, cool." And she's credited on half of all DeMille's films as either the scenarist, the writer, adapted by, or researcher. She was an impeccable researcher. He trusted her above everyone else. Literally every single one of his financial successes are tied to Jeannie in some shape or form. And she was a writer of over 50 of his films. They had offices next to each other. And on the weekends, she spent with him at Paradise Ranch, which was named for her. However, by 1930, that changed, and she was no longer spending weekends with him. Another woman had come in. 3 women kept DeMille buoyed. It was his wife, Constance, who he speaks very highly of, Jeannie, and his secretary. And these women kept him running. So the end of her career, they separated. Cecil and Jeannie separated briefly in 1930, and you could say it's for any number of reasons. Cecil B. DeMille went to a different studio. It was the Depression. They stopped having sex, whatever it is. She went to MGM. Under contract with MGM, she wrote the successful Fra Diavolo. In Europe, it was called that. Here, it was called Brother's Keeper with Laurel and Hardy. And you could see it. It's funny, and it's a different tone than she normally had with Cecil, which are these big, epic things. That's just his style. In 1934, though, she goes back with Cecil, and she's no longer listed as writer. She is now the researcher and collaborator. And they worked together until her death. And then in 1945, this film was not doing well, Unconquered, and he had sort of dropped off speaking with her. And he came to her to ask her to save it, and she was too sick, and the film was a financial flop, and she died months later. This is her obituary in the Times in 1946. So some things to notice here. She is not noted on her own. It's very short, and they have her age wrong. She was probably 58 or 59. So, and it doesn't say how she died. She had cancer. So some films of note, you might recognize some of these films. I have Male and Female, 10 Commandments, and King of Kings listed. These are the huge ones from Cecil B. DeMille, and the 1956 10 Commandments is based off of her original script. I mean, that's a very long list of credits. However, I'm going to go back to this. When I was looking at this, I was like, okay, great. This is her list of credits. What ties all these films together? So, it's easy to find this information. You just do some research, some encyclopedia articles, but nothing really made her pop. She was never married. She had no kids. She had nobody to carry on her legacy, no autobiographies, not 4 of them. And she was very private. And then there was one thing that was weird. Her mother used a different name. She's listed as Evangeline Thompson, Evangeline Claire O'Neill, just a totally different name. And it turns out her mother remarried and married this man named Henry O'Neill, who was a known gambler and barley trader. And then her mother dropped her first name, Evangeline, and went by Claire, and she became Claire O'Neill. With that information, I found an article from 1899 that said, they were caught in Montreal, Canada, Evangeline Claire Thompson with her 11-year-old daughter, caught traveling from Paris, smuggling in $150,000 worth of goods, which is $4 million today. The goods was linen, jewelry, and silverware, which she had engraved, which is such a lovely detail because that shows that she was like, no, this is my life. I own these now. And then the family spent years getting Evangeline out of trouble. And so Jeannie's life was a facade for the most part in terms of wealth. So here she is in 1916, just 16 years after this event, pretending like she is on top of the world, like she's never had any problems. And I saw these themes throughout her films. So she has strong, impertinent women, disdain for laziness. Like, she killed so many people who were just lazy. They just died. However, covetousness was totally forgivable. There's a scene in the movie The Cheat where this woman lusts after this life and this financial lifestyle that she can't afford. People die because of it. She almost goes to jail, but it's okay. In the end, she forgives it, and she ends up happy with her husband and free from jail. There's marriage and infidelity in the film Dynamite, an amazing scene where this wife is confronted by the mistress, and how, nothing I had ever seen today, and how people didn't realize that was her relationship with Constance DeMille. Women are sexually overpowered. DeMille was, he was 20 or 30 years older than she was. But above all else, her characters had humanity. So clearly her work, even though they had DeMille's fingerprint on them, they had her themes. And why is this important? Why do we care about Jeannie? So here's why. In 1957, 11 years after Jeannie had passed away, the man who supposedly loved her said she was not a good writer. She would bring in wonderful ideas, but she could not carry a story all the way through in writing. Her name is on many things because she wrote with me. I carried the story, and she would bring me many, many ideas. You'll find her name on a lot of scripts. So she's been erased. However, she completed successful works without him. She did Fra Diavolo. She did The Tarantula. She saved Universal Studios now today. And his work fell off dramatically after her death. His main claim to fame, 10 Commandments, is linked to her. So I think it's important to talk about these people today and just gonna make sure their stories live on.
That's the theme of the day, writing ourselves back into the story. That's the most important thing. So we are now going to, let me press the right button. Sorry, Jeff. Sorry. All right, we're now going to hear about Eve Unseld as soon as my computer pops back on the screen. There you go. By Laura Kirk. Thank you.
All right, I'm excited to talk about Eve as we were talking about leadership and women being in charge. She was in charge and she was smart, so she's the smart girl in charge. She weaved the famous players of the era together. She has 96 writing credits on IMDb. She wrote for stars like Mary Pickford, Lon Chaney, Clara Bow, Baby Peggy, Jack Benny. She was mentored by prominent producers, which became the repetition. I looked for the repetition in her career. When you pick these people, when they're not in any book, you really have to dig and look for the repetition. And adaptations were her forte. So why do we study her? I think we study to gain a perspective of how women navigated and dominated a rapidly changing field due to evolving formats and distribution, which I would compare to today's demand for content due to multiple platform engagement by audiences. So I think it's important as we enter the digital age and we look at all the ways we can get our work out there, that we look at how they did it. Her success was due to her education, so everyone here who's going to college, good job. Her reputation. Your reputation is so important in this field. It's a very big world, but it is small and people talk. Her skill, her work ethic, as we've heard about some of the other women, and her independence, which was fired directly in the face of gender inequality, which I will tell you about. Her early life and education, she was born in Chicago, but she grew up in Caldwell, Kansas. I am from Kansas. I'm from a farm in Kansas. It was inconceivable to me to leave the farm. I'm very interested in these women who all went to Hollywood, which was the Wild Wild West back then. She also went to Hardin College in Mexico, Missouri. She was kicked out for lighting a firecracker in a So that was how she was firing. Okay, so then she went to Christian College in Columbia, Missouri, and then she went on to Emerson in Boston. She studied drama and literature. Okay, now this was the age when women were girls no matter their age. This was one of the first clips I found. Fame for a Kansas girl. She's running the show, and she's running companies in Europe, but she's a girl. Okay, she's first worked for David Belasco, and I mean, you have to love David. He wrote these wonderful articles that every woman believes she could be an actress because it's her inherent nature, because he saw 4,000 stage-struck women a year. And he talked about mature women who are long past the first blush of youth. They are the most pathetic. He felt that theater would always persevere over film because there's, it was the titles. Remember, it's the silent film era, so how are we getting the story? We're getting pictures and we're getting titles. But they interrupt, and because theater did not have to dumb down for the masses. Now, Eve worked as a plot detector for DeMille and Beatrice, mom to Cecil and William. And then Belasco later collaborated with Lasky, who we'll see that she worked with. So many films were being made. They had to keep up with demand, so they started doing something called photoplay. She was the queen of adaptations of these novels. So here's the book. It's The Eagle's Maid by Anna Alice Chapin. Then she also did The Plastic Age, which is a little more popular. Read the book, then see the picture. So it was the first time we started doing those tie-ins, because you'd go to the movie, and then you'd go back home, and you'd just thumb through the book, and you'd look at the titles, which was what she was writing. I love this one. I have to do a dramatic reading. So I just love it. Okay, so the kiss to her was like a bullet or a dagger, and madness filled her brain, soul and blood. For one dreadful minute, she seemed to grow blind and deaf and paralyzed, and she shrieked a thin, wild shriek of rage, and she struck him with all her strength across the mouth. And so Eve boils that down to, you want to steal me for yourself. No, I want to win you. I'm fascinated. I am fascinated by the boil down. Okay, so famous players Lasky, which we heard about in some of the other ones, they merged their resources, and Paramount acted as a distributor with block booking, which reminds us of our multiplexes today. We can only see what they want us to see. And their biggest star was Mary Pickford, and she created numerous projects, but they said, okay, we want you to go and be in charge in London. We're sending you overseas. Young first employee, Hitchcock. Okay. So she was credited with teaching him the ins and outs of story and how to design title cards. So, hello. So she taught him that. She started an independent company in 1921, and it's called Her Own Company Epidemic. And so a lot of women were starting their own companies back then. And to talk just briefly about her relationship with her husband, let's look for his credit. It's at the bottom right, really tiny right down there. And there she is, top credit. It's her staff. And she wanted to bring, since she did adaptations of novels, she wanted to bring filmmakers and authors to a new level of mutual understanding. Okay, so then she starts to work for Schulberg. And he had worked with famous players. He left, he replaced Cecil, and then he was really excited about working with her, and he persuaded her to stop this drudgery, as you could see from before, of adapting scenarios from other people's stories and start to write her own. And their collaboration was promoted as they were going to wrinkle day and night over the problem of better stories. Few of her films are in a category, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called Yellow Peril. It was this fear of danger of intermarriage, population domination, and fear of the West becoming Oriental. And there, as you can see a description of one of her films, a white girl saved from the clutches of an Oriental. She got the sole writing credit for that one. Lon Chaney starred in Shadows, which was another film of this genre. Louis Gottschalk wrote the music, also for Broken Blossoms, which is another film of the era. They later collaborated on the musical. Chaney got rave reviews. Then The Plastic Age, another Schulberg collaboration, another adaptation. Now, Frederica Segor-Mas, which we're going to hear a little bit more about, obtained the galleys and has the credit, but she was unlikely to have the craft for that first screenplay. And there's no mention of Unseld in the autobiography or any book that I could find ever. She did Captain January. This was based on a children's book. starred Baby Peggy, so cute, and this is one that's fun to watch. But again, the tricky work of adapting a novel, Baby Peggy was 5, in the book the child is 10. The scenes are complex. In the film you've just got simple titles to tell that story. Adoption themes in this book are nuanced, ahead of their time. The example I give is when Captain Daddy tells Peggy that she should go and live with the people who show up. When he's the only father she's known, she tells him he lies, and she jumps out of a window. In the movie, Peggy says, "That's a great big fib," and she stomps her foot, and that's how that scene goes in the film. As we shift to talkies, The Medicine Man, 1930, Jack Benny, Unseld was likely brought in to assist Lady Whorton. Okay, personal life. Married to Lester Blankfield until her death. They co-wrote plays together. Their travel and their social life was documented, but she was always the focus. Blankfield was selected as the speaker for the Democratic National Committee. No children that I could find anything about. They settled in early Malibu, so Malibu was not Malibu that it is today. It was really wild and unsettled, and she called her cottage Me Likey, I think, perhaps due to some of the Yellow Peril films. That's a guess. That's her obituary, which I was also so sad to see how small and tiny after this life and work. So I heard a question in an earlier discussion of, well, what happened? What happened to these women? There's a wonderful article by Jane Gaines called Pink Slipped, What Happened to the Women of the Silent Film Industry? And she named it ironically, because there were no pink slips. They just went away, and I think I agree, it was following the money. So I'll leave you with this. While her name is missing from the index of a broad survey of film history books of the era, it is clear, though not famous, Eve was a player who surely merits our regard.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. All right, we're now going to hear about Adela Rogers St. John's from Sarah Whorton.
So before I introduce you to Adela, I want to show a very short clip to introduce you to her. Her sharp journalistic skills and her strong storytelling prowess. In her memoir, Love, Laughter, and Tears, she wrote, "Once when Joan Crawford and I were on a Tea Talk television show, our hostess was stressing our enduring success in our chosen fields. And Joan leaned over and put her hand on my arm and said, 'You know what's remarkable about Adela and me? We survived.' We did indeed." So Earl Rogers was Adela's father and her primary caregiver. He's actually one of the greatest criminal defense attorneys of all time, only losing 3 of his 77 cases. Most say that he inspired the fictional lawyer Perry Mason. So Adela spent a lot of time in courtrooms with her, learning from her father as well as from criminals, pickpockets, and police officers. Adela and her father shared a lot of traits. The positives were a really sharp mind and the ability to provide guidance during crisis. So Adela often lent her expertise to troubled stars and studios. And in the negatives, both Earl and Adela struggled with depression and alcoholism throughout their lifetime. Earl did introduce Adela to William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul. Hearst provided Adela with steady work throughout her lifetime and introduced her to the love of her life, reporting. So Adela once said, "Newspaper work is the most exciting thing in the world to me. It's where I live. I would do it for nothing." She began working at newspapers at age 18 and soon began covering city politics, crime, and sports. But being a girl reporter was not very easy, as many believed it was not a woman's job. But Adela worked hard and earned the respect of her peers. She's most famous for going undercover in 1931 to expose the unemployment epidemic and the inadequate charitable response to that epidemic. This next quote is one of my favorite because it highlights the additional strain that's placed on women during this time period. She writes, "Remember, we're a silk stocking and lip bruise nation. It's been bred and trained to us. As women, by the greatest advertising campaigns in the world, we have been sold the idea of beauty, of grooming, of cleanliness. And it hurts so to feel yourself slipping below the tide. Down and out, unemployed, hungry, we are still women." The 13-part series brought Adela fame and satisfaction, but it also brought important reform to the charitable agencies during that time. But Adela's influence went beyond the front page as she actually inspired a prototype of female reporters in film. Her carbon copy arrived on screen in His Girl Friday. As you can see, they're both wearing the girl reporter suit, the St. John's girl reporter suit with the stripes. It's the actual name for it. Adela soon moved to Photoplay magazine where she became known as Mother Confessor of Hollywood. So moving in motion pictures was a natural transition from covering the stars to writing for them. She mostly received story by credits with her short stories and novels being adapted for screen. She often drew from her personal experience. For example, this next clip has a little bit about her life as a reporter. So hopefully this works. We'll try this one more time. Okay, so Back in Circulation is a wonderful film. You should watch it. And it features Joan Blondell as a reporter who goes undercover on a sexy assignment. So Free Soul is one of Adela's most famous films. And it's a courtroom drama, which obviously was influenced by her formative years spent in her father's office. And it really examines her relationship with Earl Rogers, her father. The movie is about an alcoholic criminal defense attorney who has to defend his daughter's ex-boyfriend on the charge of murder. It was well received by critics. Norma Shearer was nominated for Best Actress for Academy Award, and Lionel Barrymore won for his role. Free Soul is also an early indication that Adela excelled at memoir-based writing. So other themes in Adela's work, including women who are wrestling with the expectations of modern life, and oftentimes wrestling with the idea of divorce. She wrote juicy roles for Greta Garbo, Constance Bennett, Joan Blondell, who we saw earlier, and Norma Shearer, who actually plays 2 different roles in this film. But Hollywood provided Adela with her strongest inspiration because it was a world she knew intimately. Adela's novel Skyrocket was adapted into this film, most famously Wet Price Hollywood. And it provides an interesting insight into her creative process. She was a keen observer of human nature, and when she was invited into an exclusive world, she took notes. White Price Hollywood was well received by critics and audiences alike. Adela and Jane Murfin were nominated for Best Story, but they lost to Frances Marion for The Champ, which is a wonderful film that you should all check out. So in her golden years, Adela became known as a voice of a bygone era. Appearing on talk shows and writing memoirs, she wrote, "Today I am the old woman of the sea, mother confessor turned custodian of the legends of Hollywood from first to last. If you live longer than practically anybody, you find you have a debt to the past." So hopefully this next clip will work because she talks about the importance of Photoplay magazine, and it's a wonderful insight into who she is as a person. So let's all cross our fingers.
Well, they're going to check.
Okay.
Just wait a second.
Okay.
We're okay, Paul. We'll be patient. Yes.
Okay. It's a wonderful clip.
While we're waiting, let me ask you, why did you choose?
But she actually wrote 3 different memoir-ish biographies at the end of her life, and they provide a wonderful insight into who she is as a person and the adventurous life she lived. So she has a lot of important stuff, not only about her life, but about the people she encountered, which I think is really a lesson learned about all of these women in Hollywood, is that whenever they started talking about their experience, they inevitably ran into other women in Hollywood. So it's an important part of history.
Sarah, give us 1 second.
Okay.
Having this going and that, we have to switch off. It takes 1 second. So
Okay.
we can crack it.
Okay.
Well, give us the go ahead, yeah.
I'd like to ask you about Photoplay, first of all, though. This is the magazine for which you wrote for so long. What was the role of Photoplay, do you think, in the early days of Hollywood?
Oh, it was a very big one. It was a very big one for 2 or 3 reasons. If you can imagine that I broke the engagement of Rudolph Valentino to Natasha Rambova in a monthly magazine, you can see that we had very little coverage. I mean, you know, the newspapers didn't know we existed. There were no columnists. Luella hadn't come to town. Hedda hadn't decided to be a columnist. There was no newspaper coverage. I wrote the first piece about Hollywood for a national magazine, a story about Garbo. And this was, the biggest excitement to think of getting into the History Post, a big national magazine covering everything in Hollywood. So that when we had our first press representation, really, in Photoplay magazine, and it was a beautifully run magazine. Jimmy Quirk, who edited it, was a very great editor. He'd made 3 other big magazines, Popular Mechanics, Scientific something. He was a fine editor, really fine. And we had such writers as Robert Sherwood, very good writers. So that what we said became very important to the industry.
You sold tickets, in other words.
We sold tickets. We did sell tickets, but we also sold, I think to them, we showed them that what we said was important, and we brought about the Hayes office, for example, when we tried to keep the pictures. See, now so many people don't go to pictures anymore. And in that day, we realized that you had to keep a certain level, and we did it.
A little bit. But my goodness, she is a good storyteller. So in 1970, President Richard M. Nixon awarded Adela the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her work as a journalist. And an interesting note is, as a boy, he delivered groceries to her. And as a president, he presented a medal to her. Adela knew how to survive. Her unorthodox childhood prepared her for an unorthodox life. She thrived in 2 cutthroat industries at a time when a woman's place was at home. Whenever she was invited into a privileged circle, she took notes, but she never forgot the person behind the label of movie star or unemployed woman. On the last page of her memoir, Love, Laughter, and Tears, she reflects on a life well lived. She writes, "I have realized now how many of those who have lived these legends, these beautiful yesterdays I've tried to recall for you, have gone through that door called death. They were never afraid of it. They were willing to love deeply, to laugh all of their laughter, to weep all of their tears. So I look forward to seeing them again, these my old friends, in that tavern at the end of the road where we shall all meet someday. Until then, I can say to them with my whole heart, and maybe now that you know them too, you can say it with me. Thanks for the memories."
Women's writing gives me the shivers. That's so good. That is so good. All right, that was excellent. All right, so we're going to wrap it out with one more presentation, and then we're going to have questions. So if any of these women are interesting to you or you have other thoughts about them as a group, we'll do that. The last one is going to be one of my favorite teams. It's a husband and wife writing team, Trances Goodrich and Albert Hackett, and we're going to have Julie Berkovian. Yes.
So yes, mine's a team, and don't worry, Albert Hackett was a huge champion for women and for women writers. So this wasn't like a she needed him thing. If anything, he needed her. So, okay, yes. Trances Goodrich and Albert Hackett, quite possibly best known for their Pulitzer Prize winning, I just do that, okay. And Tony Award winning play, The Diary of Anne Frank, which I could do a whole 10-minute presentation just on this, and I'm going to skip over it for the sake of their screenplays because they had lucrative careers as screenwriters as well. So Trances Goodrich grew up quite wealthy in the East Coast, New Jersey. She, very privileged upbringing, went to Vassar and then studied theater and became a professional actress for all of her 20s, essentially. And it was during that time that she met this cutie. And they met in 1923. Actually, with the first meeting, she was married, and their love story started as most do, that she found him incredibly annoying and loud. She was backstage at a show, and he was visiting a friend who was also in the play, and she had to find the person who was being so loud and disrupting her piece. So that's when they first met. And then in 1928, they ran in the same theater circles. They were both actors. Albert actually grew up doing the theater circuit in New York. Ever since he was a child, his father died when he was like 6, and his mom, who was 22 at the time, had to put the entire family into the theater so that they could like stay together. It was basically give your children up for adoption or all become actors. So they did that. And in 1928, Frances, who had been writing on the side, approached him about reading one of her plays. And he read it and tore it apart. And she was mad, but then realized he was right. And she loved the way that he challenged her. And so they just started writing together. And he was surprised that they even spoke after that first play. But they continued to work together. And their partnership was really funny and interesting. They loved each other. They fell madly in love. But as writing partners, they kind of like, part of their challenging was they would just fight a lot. They would argue, they would yell at each other. There was a story about Frances losing her voice because she screamed at him so loud about some sort of character choice, and then they couldn't work for 3 days because he couldn't hear her when she was talking. I had a quote, "Politeness was not a staple in the working relationship between Frances and Albert." There were stories of their neighbors who would just hear them screaming like all day while they worked, and then they'd leave the house holding hands. And so I just found them so funny. Frances is quoted as saying that Albert was even crueler to her. He would say things like, "If you think that's a good idea, you should be scared." And she threw in, and he would say it quietly and not lose his voice at all. They were married in 1931, and they had already written 2 successful Broadway plays together, and from that they received an offer from MGM to work as a writing team. So they moved to Hollywood, and it was here that they were at MGM that they were assigned to write The Thin Man, which was a book by Dashiell Hammett. They struggled with the story at first. In a letter to a friend, Frances said, "Albert and I do not believe it's a good script or a good book or a good story." In another correspondence, she said, "Still slaving away at The Thin Man. If only it would make me thin, I could bear it." She may have been a little overdramatic because they finished the script in 3 weeks, and when the film was released in 1934, it was a tremendous success. As most of you probably know, it went on for 6 films. MGM did 6 films. Frances and Albert only wrote 3 of them. Nick and Nora, which are their main characters, were hailed as one of the first happily married couples shown on the screen. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that they were equals. And they challenged each other, they joked around, but they loved each other. It's quoted as saying that it's not hard to imagine the leads, Nick and Nora, as slightly idealized versions of Albert and Frances. And Ian Hamilton writes in his book, Writers in Hollywood, "The Nick and Nora partnership was Dashiell Hammett's invention, but Albert and Frances Hackett knew it from within and added much that was their own." They did the sequel after The Thin Man, which was released in 1936, and they were growing tired of the movie and wanted to kill them at the end of it. MGM said no, and so Frances came up with the idea, well, if we can't kill them, we'll make her pregnant because that will ruin everything. And so they did, but then MGM still wanted it, so they cleverly titled their third and last film Another Thin Man, which I thought was kind of sarcastic and funny, which released in 1939. So between 1936 and 1939, they were growing really tired of Hollywood. Like I said, they were sick of Nick and Nora, even though they're amazing. They just like decided in 1939 that they were going to move back to the East Coast. And they bought land in Vermont, and Albert went back to acting. They wrote for the stage again, and they just enjoyed time with their family. But then they did move back to Hollywood in 1942 because they were offered a huge film from Paramount. I'm going to skip over that and go to the next one because it's a little more intriguing. In 1945, Frank Capra bought the rights to The Greatest Gift, which was just like a postcard with a tiny little 3-sentence story on the back. And he had 3 different writers take a pass at writing a script for it. Dalton Trumbo, Clifford Odets, and Mark Connolly. They all made attempts, and they just weren't good. So he hires Frances and Albert to work on this story. And it was going well at first. The process started smoothly, but while they were moving the story along, they found out that Frank Capra brought in Joe Swirling, another writer, to write behind them with him. So basically he was getting their pages and then like tweaking the story to how he wanted it to look, along with Joe Swirling. Frances and Albert were huge supporters of and champions for the Screenwriters Guild. And they knew this was illegal, and they were pissed about it, but they just kept working. Then they had a tragic meeting with Capra in which, during a disagreement, Frank Capra called Frances "my dear woman" in a condescending voice, and she got up and laughed, and Albert was like, "Oh, this is over." And then the final straw for them was that Capra was pressuring them to finish quickly, like, "Get me those pages," and she was just like, "This is terrible." But she was a professional. They were professionals. They finished their draft and they walked. They wanted nothing to do with the project ever again. I think they did attend some sort of party after the film was released, and one of the actresses at the party was saying, in referencing Capra, that he was such a genius, he would take the scene and then he'd like just simplify it as a Capra touch. He'd essentially take the scene that he rewrote, which was terrible, and use Frances and Albert's scenes, and then everyone gave him the credit, like, oh, he just simplified it down to this amazing scene. And so she and Albert decided they would never watch the film, and they never did. They both lived until their 90s, and you know, It's a Wonderful Life kind of had its success later on, after its release in the 40s, and even though it was being played every holiday, they never watched it, which I found tragic because I love this movie. We have access to the Margaret Herrick Academy Library in Los Angeles, and I was able to look at the unpublished and the published version of of It's a Wonderful Life, and all of the scenes that had Frank Capra's name in bold on them were terrible and not used in the film. So, so after this experience, they wrote several musicals for the Arthur Freed unit at MGM, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, The Pirate and Easter Parade with Judy Garland. They were responsible for the original Father of the Bride films and the sequel Father's Little Dividend, which were remade and huge successes even in the 90s. And they also wrote the Long, Long Trailer for Lucy and Desi. So many movies. Like, you guys should definitely pick up this book. Okay, I'm definitely at 10 minutes. Okay, so what they were offered the Diary of Anne Frank, worked on that for several years. Then, following the success of the play, did the screenplay, and then in the 80s did the teleplay for the TV movie. Basically, one thing that struck me about their writing team is that they knew how to take care of themselves and each other. We hear about so many women and just writers in general who had like mental breakdowns dealing with Hollywood. And I think the reason that didn't really happen to these two is because they knew when to step away and get refreshed somewhere else before they dove back in. They were married for 54 years and writing partners for nearly 60. And their love was effortless, deep, playful, and fun. In public, they were not they didn't do a lot of PDA. But when either spoke, the other concentrated intently. And I thought that would be really good. Julius Epstein is quoted as saying, without exaggeration, they were the most beloved couple in Hollywood. So, buy their book.
So we're going to have all 5 folks come up just from if anybody has any questions or any interest in either any of the people you've heard about, any of the books they've recommended. They're all good books. Nick and Nora was written by the nephew of the Hacketts because they had no children. So the nephew thought he spent and also, of course, if you have any questions about the program. So any thoughts listening to all this? Anybody interested in any of these women further? Yes, please.
I have a question about that postcard with the 3 sentences.
Yeah.
What were they? The 3 sentences.
Oh, that's a great.
I don't have it memorized. I don't know. Sorry. But it was essentially it was just, do you know what the town looks like in the movie? Just like a snow-covered town, like snow-covered street with a church. It was really just about the picture. It was a Christmas postcard. And then it just said something about greeting, like, I should know.
No, you shouldn't. You don't know. That's more.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Anybody else? Thoughts? Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think, is it Jeannie McPherson, right?
Uh-huh.
Did she write Broken Blossoms as well? Or was that someone else that I missed?
I don't have all of her credits listed. I think so.
Yes. It was Griffin, one of Griffith's.
Yeah, yes, it is.
yes.
And that was one of the Yellow Pearl.
Yeah, I was
films.
going to say that.
Okay, so it was Eve. Was it Eve Unseld?
No, she did not write that one. I was just including that in talking about a certain genre of film that was during that era, specific to that era.
Awesome.
I feel like she did.
Have you seen that film?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. Anybody else? Yes.
So it seems that none of these 5 women had children. Is that right?
Adela had 2 children.
These women didn't, but other women we've studied have. Yeah, it is possible.
Yeah. We have 20 students in the program, and they all wrote about a different woman, and there are many of those women who had children, but by accident. That's true. That's true. But it does speak to the fact that it was a very demanding job, and often was not possible. And I know in the Albert and Frances world, he was 12 years her senior. Or no, she was 12 years his senior.
Yeah.
So she was by the time they married.
She was nearly 40 when they got married. And it didn't really seem like, I know that when questioned, she didn't really comment on it. She was kind of like, I owe no one an explanation for not having children. But Albert would be like, I have everything I want. What would I do with a child? Like, I don't even know what I would do with that. So he was cool with that too. It was their choice.
The family choice. And also, Toni's going to be writing about Phoebe Ephron, who you'll recognize the last name. She's the mother of Nora Ephron. So Phoebe Ephron, who was a writer in the 50s with her husband, had 4 children, all of whom grew up to be writers.
What was the clip, the thing with Albert Hitchcock?
It was in her golden years she wrote for television, and it's for the Alfred Hitchcock series Presents, the television show. And in the very first season, I think it's episode 10, she writes an episode about a woman who's struggling with alcoholism and her desire to be sober, and society's really inability to accept that choice. And so it actually is a really powerful 15 minutes of television for Hitchcock, and it's wonderful. At the end, he credits her with the story and says that he hopes that people are affected by it and impacted by it, which I think is pretty impressive for her style of writing and her impact, because he was not one for giving credit to other people. So the fact that he would take the time to recognize her work is pretty impressive, and it's on Netflix.
Okay, thanks.
So,
Cool. Yes. All right. What? I got.
Make one pitch, just so people know. The collected essays of this research project will be published as a book in about a year.
Yeah,
right?
about a year
Because
and a
we have
half.
to
All in one sale for the next Citizens Day. Yeah,
So the Broken Flowers thing in regards to Yellow Peril, I'm not sure if she wrote that, but however, she did write The Cheat, which did have a lot of Yellow Peril, Yellow Fear in it. But what I noticed was really spectacular. If you saw with Unseld, there was obviously whitewashing. I mean, it's the 20s, it's the teens. She didn't do that. Jeannie McPherson's films did not have that. She used actual Asian actors and showed them in all stripes, and I found that really remarkable.
Definitely at that time.
Cool. Yes.
Just a comment. how wonderfully fascinating this was. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're so excited you came. We appreciate that very much.
That was my question. Is this going to be published? I'm so happy to know that it will be. So
Yes.
And I would add that as we worked on these, I think we all, I mean, I know I'm the first person to ever research or write about my subject because it was really hard. But I felt it was so important, and we all felt like we were going back in history in a cold case way to kind of find out who these people are. So it's a pleasure to be able to share them with you and the world. And I thank Stephens College for having this program and this work happening.